Well, it is a compromise at the end because it is higher than some member states wanted, particularly in Eastern and Central Europe, who were disconcerted about the levels of which the European Union were intending to reach those carbon emission targets. They feel that their transition is much steeper in incline than many in Western and Northern Europe. For example, in Poland, there were serious concerns. 80% of their electricity comes still from coal. They're going to have a pretty tough transition to a more carbon neutral environment over the next couple of decades. And so they were saying, if you want us to reach these rather more ambitious targets, you're going to have to try and help us. And that's why we did see those pretty tough negotiations at this EU Council summit, lasting some 8 hours, as member states who wanted Europe to go greener faster kind of were in combat with those that wanted a rather slower process. And there are those concerns. You know, there are 11 million jobs that are reliant on kind of carbon emitting industries across Europe. Many of those jobs potentially may well be in doubt. And for countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria and others, they wanted guarantees, not just that there would be extra funding, but also that there would be kind of tasks and missions put in place to ensure that those jobs, even if they weren't going to be protected, that people would be retrained into new industries. But this is a sign, a signal from the European Union that it is committed to trying to tackle climate change. We know there are going to be talks all over this weekend involving the United Nations, France and Britain. 2021 is going to be a key year, and the EU were determined that at this summit, before the end of the year, the last one of 2020, that they would send that strong signal. Now, I've spoken to Anna Casavina. She is a Green MEP, a German MEP, and I began by asking her whether she was pleased with the announcement that was made today, whether she thought it had gone far enough.
First of all, it is very good that we have an agreement because, as you know, also here Poland was threatening actually an EU position. So having an agreement of 55% at least CO2 reduction till 2030 is a very important sign 5 years after Paris. But of course, it is not enough. If you listen to science, if you listen to the protesters on the street, we need much more action. The parliament is actually having the position that we need 60% CO2 reduction till 2030, and we will fight for that in the upcoming negotiations.
In saying that, at least Poland's position, and indeed many other Eastern and Central European countries, is understandable. I mean, you know, this is a big transition for them, much bigger than we're facing in Western Europe, and they deserve help, don't they?
Absolutely. But as you know, the European Union also put in place a special fund dedicated for financing the transition, because indeed we need to help the countries that have still a very high coal and fossil fuel energy mix. We need to make sure that people who work in those sectors don't lose their jobs. And for all of that, we need to finance the transition. This is clear, but there is...
Well, the question is that they are going to lose their jobs. The question and what they're concerned about is where are the new ones going to come from? Because clearly, if we're going to stop carbon emissions, we're going to stop digging coal, what people fear is what do they turn to next? Because many communities rely on these industries.
Yeah, if you look, for example, at the German example, there a lot of the people working in coal will be anyhow retired until we really have the full phase out of coal. And you had transformations of the economy in the past centuries, like always happening. And I think we are better off if we manage the transition and we manage it early enough and look into the future instead of just letting it go on until the bitter end and then fall into this catastrophe. So better start early, manage the transition, think about, for example, other business models, sustainable tourism, circular economy models. So there is a lot of potential in the fossil-free economy, and I think a lot of those jobs will also be for those people working today.
Now, clearly, as we've seen there, for some MEPs, this doesn't go far enough. It's not ambitious enough, Oliver. They do want the European Union to go further. Now, next year is going to be a crucial year when it comes to climate change, because the COP annual summit, which was due to be held this year, will now take place next year in Glasgow. It's the most significant since Paris, when those big decisions were made in terms of reaching targets for carbon emissions for the decades to come. But be in no doubt, I think, though, for Green campaigners, even though they see this as a compromise, even though they know they do have to try and help particularly those countries that will be worst affected by these reductions, that this is a first step, that these targets can change, that they could become more ambitious. And that is why ultimately I think most of them are pretty happy today that this deal has finally been able to be reached and that a compromise has between the different member states, the different groupings inside the EU, that they've managed to get that over the line.